Hello everybody, this is Eric Stinton and today we're going to be learning about the effects of exercise on students with ADHD. But first, we're going to figure out where we're going to go first. So we're going to get introduced to ADHD, learn some of the science behind it and why that science matters. Then we're going to talk about medication, exercise as an intervention, and the science behind exercise as an intervention. We're going to discuss a few ways to implement that intervention and then wrap it up with a conclusion and a list of references. Meet ADHD. Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder is a behavioral disorder that is associated with a neurological deficiency in dopamine receptors, which mostly affects memory and attention. Roughly 5% of all school-age students have ADHD, making it one of the most common learning disabilities in existence. Behaviors associated with ADHD include fidgeting and squirming in seat, leaving the seat abruptly, and general out-of-seat behavior when in-seat behavior is expected, excessive running, climbing, and talking, difficulty with details and making careless errors, spacing off, daydreaming, forgetfulness, and significant attention paid to extraneous stimuli. So things that are easy to ignore are actually very difficult to ignore for students with ADHD. Now let's get into the science. And the reason we're talking about some science is because I think alongside case studies that are functional and applicable in the real environment of a classroom, it's important to complete that knowledge with science and knowledge from the lab or some kind of scientific avenue. I think it gives us an important background of information on why things are working or not working. So, science has yet to reveal what the exact causes of ADHD are, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that it is in fact genetic. Some of the cool case studies that were done, they interviewed or they followed two twins separated at birth, and they did it with lots of different twins. But when the twins shared the same genetic material, 80% of the time, if one of the twins had ADHD, the other one also had ADHD, regardless of the environment they grew up in or the parents they had. So a lot of cool stuff. There are also a lot of neural scanning that has been done to show that parts of the brain, in particular some parts of the frontal cortex, are actually atrophied in students with ADHD. And that has a lot to do with that dopamine deficiency. But things that do not cause ADHD are also important to know because there are a lot of myths floating around on what causes it. It's important to separate fact from fiction. So bad parenting, too much TV, and poor diet do not cause ADHD. Although they certainly aren't helpful for students with ADHD, they also do not cause it. I've been dropping this dopamine bomb a couple of times now, so it's important to understand what it is, and we'll go on to talk about it more as we go along. What dopamine is a neurotransmitter, which is an agent that transfers electric impulses in the brain from one nerve cell to the next. And this is essentially the motor of our cognition when that happens. What dopamine in particular regulates is the functioning surrounding memory and attention. Now, I'm going to group memory and attention here, even though ADHD typically focuses on attention, or that's what our association is. But memory is just as important, and not only because of its connection through dopamine, but also because it is not important, or being able to pay attention doesn't really matter if you don't remember what you paid attention to. So it's important that we focus on retention as well as attention. And here are some other attentional factors. There's the 10-minute rule, which states that people are naturally inclined to pay attention to something for about 10 minutes before they want to change attention to something else. There's also the Captain Obvious rule, that people pay attention when something's interesting. We don't like boring things. There's the emo rule, that people pay more attention and produce more dopamine, not surprisingly, when they are emotionally engaged. There are tests done on people, and they were put in the neural scanners, and when they were told to make a decision that was based off of emotional engagement, that not only would dopamine levels increase, but in general, your whole cognition, the electric activity in your brain, started to increase dramatically. Now, all these rules affect every person, but they're just much more pronounced for students with ADHD. So what, bro? Why do I care? You should care because ADHD affects both the student's behavior and their academic performance. We want to avoid that perfect storm of difficulty because they often feed off of each other. Not only that, ADHD is very prevalent. If you haven't already had students that have ADHD, it is very likely, almost guaranteed, I would say, that you will one day have a student that has ADHD. Not only that, if teachers are not familiar with what ADHD is and what strategies there are to address it, it's going to suck. It's going to suck for the teacher as well as the student. It's going to lead to a very frustrating experience for all parties, and that's what we want to avoid. It is difficult to divorce the ideas of medication and ADHD. They often are brought up in the same breath. Because there are physiological and biochemical markers of ADHD, a lot of the times medication is prescribed. The typical prescriptions are stimulants like Adderall, Concerta, or Ritalin, those being the three most commonly used. And although they all go about it differently, the same end result is always that these are used to block the natural dopamine reuptake. And what that means is that when your brain is transferring dopamine, or when dopamine is transferring electricity from one nerve to the other, it generally gets recycled back to the original nerve. And this way the brain is just using it well. However, when it's blocked, what happens is their dopamine levels fall and they slowly rise to a baseline as the brain starts to produce more and more because it's not getting recycled. And in that process of lowering it and going back to the baseline allows students to concentrate for a longer period of time. Not only that, the end result is their brain goes into overdrive and produces a ton of dopamine, and it essentially makes them work, it makes the brain function for much longer. There is a flip side, however. Parents are often hesitant to medicate a child due to perceptions and stigma that there's something wrong with their child or their child has a mental problem. And those can be fair feelings. It's difficult to empathize with that. However, there are also some medical risks. Even though it's generally a pretty safe form of medication for perfectly healthy people, if you can take too many of them and risk lots of different effects, particularly concerned with heart. But if there's other health concerns in the family or in the student themselves, there can be a more hesitance to prescribe any kind of medication. There are some side effects that include loss of appetite, headaches, difficulty sleeping, restlessness, abdominal pain, discomfort, and dry mouth. And although there are other ones, those are the most predominant ones. Excuse my impersonation of the commercial guy who goes through them really fast. However, in my mind, what is the most significant reason why people are not sold on medication is that it's not a sure bet. For lots of students, medication works very well, and for lots of students, it does nothing. So, given the other factors, if there isn't a high probability or a guarantee that medication is going to work, it's possible to encounter a lot of parents who just do not want to have it. Now we're about 10 minutes through, so let me re-engage you real quick with a little bit of emotion. Right now, the reason I chose to do this intervention is because I have a student that is becoming very frustrating for both of us. Because he has ADHD, his parents don't want to have medication, and he's bombing all his classes and he's having a really terrible time and hates school. And that's not what I want. I like the guy and I think he's a good kid. So I've been trying to work with the parents, but what I've been learning is that I need to shift as many variables that are under my control in order to really see success. And I can't control the decisions that his parents makes. So what I can do is when he's in the classroom, I can manipulate that variable and I can include exercise, for example. Now, aside from health benefits and mood benefits, exercise has been shown to improve student performance, decrease off-task behavior, and improve student attitude. These benefits are particularly effective with ADHD, but it benefits everybody. Exercise is effective for students of all ages and can be used to increase or decrease behaviors depending on how it's used. So you can say, do these problems, and you can get some playtime outside, or they can be used to decrease off-task behavior by using stand-up desks. And we're going to talk about both those options shortly. But it can also be used as a way to teach students a strategy to cope with their own challenges on their own. So even when Mr. Stinton's not around, they will hopefully, ideally, be able to say, hey, right now I'm having a hard time concentrating because of my ADHD, but I remember what I used to do, and I can apply that now as a way to engage my ADHD. There's also scientific backing for exercise in this. Now, there's evidence, and all of the things when I say talk about science, they are in my reference section, and feel free to ask me about them if you need some clarification. But research has shown that cognitive functioning overall improves when there's increased blood flow to the brain, because that carries oxygen, and that's what propels a lot of that electric transfer. This results in high levels of dopamine. By using exercise as an intervention, you also provide an appropriate medium for activity. We mentioned earlier that excessive running and climbing can be behaviors associated with ADHD, and running by itself or climbing by itself are not problem behaviors, but in certain contexts they become inappropriate. This provides an appropriate context for that activity. Also, when we think about the 10-minute rule, exercise can be used powerfully as a re-engaging tool. So if they start to fade, have them move around, and you can bring them back into it. This also acts as an effective complement or substitute for medication. We're going to talk about at least 3 ways to implement exercise as an intervention. Ideally, you'd use them all together, but I understand that that's not always feasible. Teachers do a lot of stuff and have a lot on their plate. So you can use them individually, but if possible, using them with each other would be optimal. The first way is to use physical activity as a reward. Like the example I gave earlier, if you do these math problems, we can go outside. Teachers can it teaches students appropriate context for physical activity, and it also gives students an opportunity to expend that energy. When I was teaching in 2nd grade, I would do this with a student who, after so many math problems done, we'd go outside, and I even incorporated math with it because we go to this map that had all of the 50 states with their, they all had numbers on them for which state they were the union. So, for example, I would say find 26 plus 8, and he would do the math, figure out 34, and then run and jump on the 34th state, which I really don't know which state that is, so I'm sorry if that's where you're from. But that was one way that we got to do it. However, there are limitations here. It does not explicitly instill the value of exercise as a lifelong strategy. It can become perceived as a Pavlov's dog kind of, I do something, I get what I want, I do something, I get what I want. And it does not necessarily become a learned strategy for future. It can also cause conflict in the classroom if other students perceive it as a special treatment, like why does Billy get to go outside and I don't, kind of a thing. It requires teacher knowledge on physical activity and fitness, which may require training of the teacher, because it shouldn't be a free play time. If it is a free play time where they go and play for a little bit, it's difficult for them to transition back into classroom mode. You want to make it a conscious and productive, concerted effort to get physical activity, get a break, but be able to seamlessly transition back to the classroom activities. The second way is to have designated exercise breaks. Before or after lessons, have a period dedicated where people can stretch or do exercises or have activities or games. And I've read about some schools doing this school-wide, but there's also certain classes that like to do this, or just appropriating it for an individual. It gives them students a break. It allows them to kind of reset and refresh. It can be fun. It can be a bonding experience for all the classmates together, and you can teach them different types of things that in general are good for their physical fitness and their life health. There are limitations to this, however, as well. Unless these breaks are repeated consistently throughout the day, the benefits are going to be temporary. So even if Billy gets a 10-minute break and is on task for 30 minutes afterwards, there's a high chance that he will begin to fade unless you repeat that physical break. This again requires teacher knowledge on physical activity and fitness, so they might need to get trained, but most importantly is that it eats up school time, and that if you're going to be given 10 or 20 minutes a day dedicated to this throughout a year, that's a lot of time that students are not learning. And that can definitely be a problem in the big picture. The final way to do it would be to incorporate exercise into lessons. This can be done using technology like stand-up desks, having those big rubber yoga balls as the chairs, or tying elastic bands to the seat legs so kids can fidget while do their work. The advantage of the technology aspect is that you don't really have to change anything, that it's built into their positioning, so your lessons and your style can essentially stay the same. However, you can also vary your lessons and just incorporate more movement. Have the students stand up, engage each other, move around. And that way, it diversifies your lesson and makes it more engaging. The difficulty there, though, is that a lot of teachers already have their curriculum and their lesson plans and have been doing it, and this requires going back forth and changing things. So it's more work for the teacher, and it can be difficult for them to adapt. Also, as in with all things, the technology just might not be a feasible purchase for the school. All schools have budgets, and that's the reality that we live with. So not a whole lot of control there. Alright guys, we're pretty much done here, so I just want to do a recap. We've gone a long way. I appreciate you guys paying attention. So, we learned that students with ADHD have a hard time sustaining attention and remembering information, primarily due to dopamine deficiencies. Exercise, we learned, can be used as a complement or a substitute for medication. Implementation is reasonable, it's pretty easy most of the time and can be pretty fun, and has been shown to increase academic performance and decrease off-task behaviors. Exercise can break up the monotony of lessons and lectures and engage students more interactively. And finally, exercise increases brain function, metabolic processes, and energy levels of students. So lots of benefits there. Here is a list of some of my references. I would encourage you guys to follow up on them, and please, if you have any questions, do let me know. And the remaining references that I used. Again, thank you guys very much. I appreciate it, and until next time, I will see you later.